They humiliated the young rancher. A week later, 300 warriors waited for him at dawn. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin the story. The sun had just started to dip beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the wide plains of the western frontier. Dust swirled in the wind as the small town of Harper's Ridge settled into the quiet of the evening. But for young Luke Weston, this was not a peaceful night. Just hours earlier, he had been humiliated in front of the entire town. He had come to Harper's Ridge to make a living, to work his ranch and build a future. But instead, he found himself at the mercy of a group of powerful men who looked down on him because of his youth, his humble beginnings, and his quiet nature. They had ridiculed him, mocked his small ranch and his efforts, and even worse, they had made sure the entire town saw his disgrace. The leader of the group, a man named Bennett Calloway, had made sure that Luke's every word and action was twisted into something laughable. When Luke had tried to stand up for himself, Calloway had slapped him across the face, telling him he wasn't worth the dirt beneath his boots. The crowd had laughed, and Luke's face had burned with shame. He had been humiliated, not just by Calloway, but by the whole town. They had turned their backs on him, leaving him to walk away with nothing but the bitter taste of defeat. But Luke wasn't the type of man to take such a blow lying down. As he walked back to his small cabin, the sting of the slap still fresh on his face, something inside him shifted. He realized he couldn't let them win. He couldn't let them define him. That night, under the pale light of the moon, Luke made a decision. He would not stand for this. He would return, and he would show them all that he was stronger than they could ever imagine. It was not just about revenge. It was about respect, about proving that even the smallest rancher could stand up against the tide of cruelty and injustice. The next morning, Luke packed his few belongings and set out toward the distant mountains. He had no army, no friends, but he knew one thing. He had the will to change his fate. Little did he know that in the days to come, he would find himself not alone in his quest for justice. As Luke trained, pushed his body to the limit, and honed his skills, he met a group of Apache warriors who saw something in him that no one else had. They saw a man who was willing to fight for what was right. They saw a man who was not afraid to stand up against overwhelming odds. And so, the path that Luke had chosen would not be walked alone. With the Apache warriors at his side, Luke would return to Harper's Ridge, not as the defeated rancher who had been humiliated, but as a man with the strength to take back his honor. 1 week later, at the crack of dawn, Luke and his new comrades approached the town of Harper's Ridge. In the distance, the rising sun cast a golden hue over the plains, but it was not the beauty of the morning that drew their attention. It was the sight of hundreds of warriors, all lined up in perfect formation, waiting for them. The warriors stood like statues, their faces hard and unmoving, their presence a silent promise of what was to come. Luke's heart raced as he rode toward them, but he didn't stop. He didn't hesitate. This was his moment, the moment when he would reclaim his dignity, his honor, and his future. The town of Harper's Ridge would soon learn that no one, no matter how powerful, could break a man's spirit without facing the consequences. As Luke and his band of Apache warriors approached the outskirts of Harper's Ridge, the morning air grew heavier with tension. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long, deep shadows that stretched across the plains. The warriors, silent and focused, moved with an eerie precision, their faces set in grim determination. Luke rode at the front, his heart pounding in his chest, but there was no fear in his eyes. The humiliation he had endured only a week ago had been replaced with something stronger, resolve. It was a strange feeling, knowing that the power he once lacked had been found in the very people who had once been his enemies. The Apache, fierce and proud, had taught him not just how to fight, but how to survive. They had taken him in when no one else would, showing him the ways of the land, the art of war, and the strength of spirit. Now, together, they would return to the place that had shamed him. The town of Harper's Ridge would witness not just his comeback, but the fury of those who had been wronged by the hands of power. As they approached the town, The warriors slowed their pace, forming a tight line behind Luke. They weren't here for a simple fight. They were here to make a statement. At the edge of the town, Luke stopped his horse, his eyes scanning the horizon. The town was quiet, almost eerily so, as if everyone had gone inside to hide. But Luke knew better. He knew that the people of Harper's Ridge were waiting, expecting something, perhaps a confrontation, perhaps an apology. What they didn't expect was the strength and unity Luke had gained from his time with the Apache. He raised his hand, signaling the warriors to halt. There was a small, weathered barn in the distance, where the mockery had taken place only days before. It was there that Calloway and his men had laughed at him, throwing insults and tearing down what little pride he had left. That barn, now a symbol of his pain, would soon be a symbol of his triumph. As Luke dismounted from his horse, he could feel the weight of the moment settling on him. He was not just a rancher anymore, nor was he just a man seeking vengeance. He had become a symbol of strength, dignity, and the relentless pursuit of justice. The warriors behind him remained silent, their presence a powerful reminder of the stakes at hand. The sun was rising higher now, and with it came the inevitable confrontation. From the town square, the first figure appeared. It was Bennett Calloway, the man who had humiliated Luke just days ago. He stood at the edge of the town, looking at Luke with a mixture of disbelief and irritation. His men stood behind him, their eyes wary but confident. They had no idea what was coming. "You should have stayed away, Weston," Calloway called out, his voice laced with contempt. "This is our town, and you're nothing but a speck of dust in the wind. Your little stunt with the Apache won't save you." Luke stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "This town doesn't belong to you, Calloway. It never did. And neither do the people you've trampled on. You'll see that soon enough." Calloway smirked, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver. "You think you can scare me with your savages? They're nothing but animals." The words were like a slap in the face to the Apache warriors behind Luke, but he raised a hand, signaling them to stay calm. They didn't need to respond with violence. Not yet. "No, Calloway," Luke said, his voice steady. "I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to show you what happens when you push a man too far. I'm here for justice, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." The silence that followed was thick with tension, and for a moment, it seemed as though time itself had stopped. The warriors behind Luke tightened their grips on their weapons, but Luke held them back. This was his fight, his moment. It was a fight for justice, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been wronged by the likes of Calloway. As Luke stepped forward, he could hear the faint sound of horses approaching. He didn't need to look back to know that more riders were coming. Riders who had seen the injustice and decided that it was time for things to change. He had called them here, not with words, but with his actions. His return had ignited something in them. The call for justice was louder than the call for revenge. Calloway's face twisted with anger as the sound of hooves grew louder, but Luke didn't flinch. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The town of Harper's Ridge would not be the same after today. The sound of hooves echoed in the still morning air as Luke and his warriors stood face to face with Bennett Calloway and his men. The tension in the air was thick, so thick it almost felt like the entire world had stopped spinning. Luke could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he stood tall, unwavering. Behind him, the Apache warriors stood in perfect formation, their faces stoic, their eyes cold and focused. They had come to stand with him, but this battle was his to fight. Luke had been humiliated, beaten down, and forced to walk away from his dignity. Now, he was back, stronger, more determined than ever, and he wasn't alone. The Apache were with him, and together, they would show Harper's Ridge what true strength looked like. Calloway, still smirking, stood with his hands on his hips, looking at Luke as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. "You really think this will change anything, Weston?" he sneered. "This town belongs to men like me, not to you or your savage friends." His words stung, but Luke didn't flinch. The hatred in Calloway's voice was the same kind of hatred that had led to Luke's humiliation just days before, but now, it was only fuel for the fire burning inside him. "You've underestimated me, Calloway," Luke replied, his voice steady and strong. "And you've underestimated them," he added, gesturing to the warriors behind him. Calloway's smirk faltered for just a second, but he quickly regained his composure. He drew his revolver from its holster, the metallic click echoing in the silence. "You think you can stand up to me?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You and your gang of savages are no match for me and my men." But Luke wasn't afraid. He had faced worse than Calloway, and he knew that this time, he had something that Calloway didn't: honor. "You don't need to fight me, Calloway," Luke said, stepping forward, his eyes never leaving the other man's. "You just need to face the truth." Calloway's face twisted in anger, and for a brief moment, it looked like he was going to draw his weapon. But then, something changed. A rider appeared in the distance, kicking up dust as he rode toward them at breakneck speed. It was clear he had come from the town. As he got closer, Luke recognized the man. It was Marshal Rickson, the lawman of Harper's Ridge. He had seen Luke as nothing more than a nuisance in the past, but today, he was coming to see what would unfold. The marshal rode up. To Luke, his face grim. He looked at the Apache warriors, his gaze lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. "What's this about, Weston?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of hesitation. Luke didn't take his eyes off Calloway. "It's about justice," Luke said firmly. "It's about what happens when a man is pushed too far. And it's about what happens when the people who think they own this town forget that there are others who live here, too." The marshal shifted uneasily in his saddle, clearly unsure of where this was going. Calloway, however, was furious. "You're wasting your time, Rickson," he snapped. "These people don't belong here. They're nothing but trouble, and now they're trying to make a scene." Rickson glanced at the warriors again, his eyes narrowing. "I know who they are," he said, his voice low. "But this isn't the time for a fight." Calloway was about to retort, but before he could, one of the Apache warriors stepped forward, his eyes locked on the lawman. "This is not just about a fight," the warrior said, his voice calm but carrying a weight of authority that silenced the crowd. "This is about respect. For the land, for the people, and for what's right." The marshal seemed to pause, considering the warrior's words. There was a long silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that precedes a shift in the balance of power. Luke knew this moment was crucial. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about what Calloway had done to everyone who had ever been silenced, mocked, or pushed down. "You can call us what you want, Calloway," Luke said, stepping forward once more, his eyes now locked on the arrogant man before him. "But the truth is, we're here for what's right, and you won't stop us." Calloway sneered, but deep down, he knew something had changed. He wasn't just facing Luke anymore. He was facing the spirit of justice itself. The warriors behind Luke stood firm, silent but powerful, their presence a living testament to the strength of unity and the price of standing up for what was right. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, the tension grew, and the fate of Harper's Ridge hung in the balance. As the tense silence between Luke, his Apache warriors, and the people of Harper's Ridge stretched on, something shifted in the air. The sun now hung higher in the sky, casting a warm, golden light on the men gathered in the middle of the street. The moment was approaching, and Luke could feel the weight of it pressing against him. This was no longer just a fight for his honor. It was a fight for the soul of the town itself. Calloway's arrogance was palpable, but there was something in his eyes now, something that betrayed a crack in his confidence. Luke could see it. The others couldn't. Calloway wasn't as untouchable as he had once thought. The town's leader was starting to realize that the power he once held over the land, and over the people, was slipping away. The Apache warriors were not just men who could fight. They were a force of nature, built on the principles of honor, strength, and loyalty to one another. They were here, not to destroy, but to show that there was another way, a way that Luke had learned during his time with them. Calloway's hand tightened around the grip of his revolver, but before he could act, Marshal Rickson spoke again, his voice low but firm. "This isn't the way, Weston," he said, looking at Luke with an expression that was almost pleading. "I know what you're trying to do, but you don't have to go this far. There's got to be another way to resolve this." Luke glanced at the marshal, then at the warriors behind him. He knew Rickson was a man torn between the law and his duty to the people he swore to protect. But Luke wasn't here for compromise anymore. "This is the way, Marshal," Luke said quietly, his voice steady, even though his heart raced in his chest. "This town has been built on the backs of men like me, men who were never given a chance. But those days are over. It's time for change, and it starts with me." Rickson hesitated, and in that moment, The marshal knew that he had lost control of the situation. Luke was right. It was time for change. There would be no more turning the other cheek, no more silently enduring the humiliation. What happened here today would ripple through the town, through every corner of the land. It would be a message that no one, not even the most powerful man in Harper's Ridge, could ignore. Luke, Rickson said softly, lowering his voice, I can't stop this, but I can help make sure it ends without more bloodshed. Luke nodded, his eyes never leaving Calloway. He appreciated the marshal's offer, but there was no going back now. I don't want bloodshed, Luke said, but I'm not leaving until justice is done. Calloway took a step forward, his revolver still drawn. You've made a mistake, Weston, he growled. You think you've got the upper hand, but you're just another fool with a dream. Dreams don't win wars. Luke took a deep breath, standing taller. Maybe not, Calloway, he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. But justice does. Without another word, Luke turned toward the Apache warriors. The warriors, in perfect harmony, began to move, their steps quiet but deliberate. They weren't here to fight, at least not yet. They were here to make a point. Luke walked to the center of the street, and as he did, the warriors spread out around him, their eyes fixed on the men of Harper's Ridge. The crowd that had gathered around the town square began to murmur, but there was an unmistakable shift in the air. Fear. For the first time, the townspeople felt what it was like to be the ones on the receiving end of judgment. The warriors didn't need to speak to make their presence felt. It was enough that they were here, standing with Luke, showing their unity. The message was clear. They would not be pushed around anymore. Calloway's bravado started to fade. He raised his revolver, but his hand trembled. The faces of the Apache warriors were unyielding, their gazes unwavering. You think you can scare me? Calloway spat, his voice breaking slightly. I've dealt with men like you before. Luke stepped forward, raising a hand to stop his warriors. He didn't want this to escalate into something it didn't need to be. He wanted Calloway to understand. This isn't about fear, Luke said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that seemed to make the air itself stand still. This is about respect. You took something from me, something that can't be replaced. And now, you'll pay the price for it. Calloway's eyes widened, and for the first time, Luke saw doubt flicker behind the anger. The man was breaking. You've made your choice, Calloway, Luke said, taking a step back. Now, you'll face the consequences. As the words left his lips, the warriors behind him moved, slowly, deliberately, their eyes locked on the men of Harper's Ridge. The silence that followed was more deafening than any noise could have been. Luke's eyes never left Calloway, and for the first time in this long, painful journey, Luke felt the power of what he had become, a man willing to stand tall, willing to fight, and willing to bring justice to those who had never seen it before. The standoff in Harper's Ridge was now at its breaking point. The sun was high in the sky, casting its hot, unforgiving light on the dusty street where Luke Weston and his Apache warriors stood face to face with Bennett Calloway and his men. The silence was suffocating, thick with anticipation, as if the very air around them was holding its breath. Calloway stood with his hands still trembling around the grip of his revolver. But now, there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had never thought that anyone, especially a young rancher like Luke, would dare challenge him. But here they were, and Luke was not backing down. You don't scare me, Weston, Calloway said, his voice shaky but still laced with defiance. This is my town. I make the rules here. Luke stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Calloway's. His voice was calm, yet firm. Not anymore, he said. You've taken everything from the people of this town, used them, mocked them, but that ends today. You don't own this place. The people here deserve more than your tyranny. Calloway's face contorted with rage, but Luke didn't flinch. He was standing not just for himself, but for every person in Harper's Ridge who had suffered under Calloway's rule. The Apache warriors behind him shifted, their presence alone speaking volumes. They were not here for bloodshed, but they were not afraid to fight if it came to that. Calloway's men, standing behind their leader, exchanged uneasy glances. They had followed Calloway blindly, trusting in his power, but now they were uncertain. They had seen what the Apache were capable of, and the sight of their stoic faces, unmoving and resolute, made them realize just how much danger they were truly in. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to be cut with a knife. Luke took another step forward, his voice rising with a sense of finality. This town will no longer bow to you, Calloway. You will answer for what you've done. Calloway's anger boiled over. He raised his revolver, his eyes wild with fury. I'll never let you take what's mine, he shouted. But as he did, his hand faltered. The fear was creeping in, the fear that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as untouchable as he had always believed. Luke saw it, Calloway's hesitation, and it was enough. The warriors behind him began to move, slow and deliberate, positioning themselves around the town square. But Luke raised a hand, signaling them to hold their ground. This wasn't a fight he wanted. Not yet. He stepped closer to Calloway, narrowing the gap between them until they were only a few feet apart. I don't want to fight you, Calloway, Luke said, his voice steady. But I will if I have to. This isn't just about me. It's about every person you've wronged, every life you've destroyed. You can still walk away. Calloway's eyes flickered, uncertainty clouding his mind. For the first time, he wasn't sure what to do. He had been the one in control for so long, the one who had manipulated, belittled, and intimidated everyone around him. But now, the ground was shifting beneath his feet. He looked around at his men, but none of them met his gaze. They weren't sure they could follow him anymore. Luke knew this was his moment. It was now or never. You've built your life on lies and fear, Calloway, Luke continued, his voice quiet but carrying a weight of authority. But you can't scare me. You can't scare the people who are ready for change. They're done living in fear. And so am I. The crowd that had gathered began to murmur, their voices a mix of uncertainty and hope. The townspeople, who had once been afraid of Calloway's wrath, were beginning to feel the stirrings of something new, something that had been buried deep within them for too long. Hope. As Calloway stood there, his revolver still raised but his hand shaking, something inside him snapped. He realized he was no longer the man in control. Luke had stripped that from him, not through force, but through courage and conviction. Slowly, Calloway lowered his weapon, his face red with rage and humiliation. You think you've won? He spat. You think this changes anything? Luke didn't answer. Instead, he turned his back on Calloway and walked toward the edge of town, where the Apache warriors waited. The crowd parted as he passed, the weight of his presence sending a ripple through the people of Harper's Ridge. Luke had not won through violence. He had won through something far more powerful, through truth, through justice, and through the simple act of standing up for what was right. As he reached the edge of town, Luke looked back over his shoulder at Calloway. The man was still standing in the street, defeated, broken. Luke didn't need to say another word. The message had been sent. Harper's Ridge was no longer Calloway's. It was the people's, and Luke had become the symbol of that change. The Apache warriors turned and began to move out, their work here done. Luke didn't need their help anymore. He had found his strength. And now, so had the people of Harper's Ridge. As Luke stood at the edge of Harper's Ridge, watching the town that had once humiliated him, something inside him shifted. The anger and humiliation that had driven him to this moment seemed to fade, replaced by something deeper, understanding. The fight wasn't over, but the first battle had been won. The victory wasn't about defeating Calloway or showing off strength. It was about reclaiming the town for the people, for those who had been silenced for so long. Luke took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what he had just done. He had faced down Calloway, the man who had thought himself untouchable, and emerged victorious. But it wasn't just Calloway he had defeated. It was the idea that people like him had no voice, no power. He had shown the town that even the smallest rancher, with no title or power to his name, could change the course of history. The Apache warriors behind him slowly began to disperse, their task complete. They had come, not to fight, but to stand in solidarity with Luke. They had fought not just with their weapons, but with their presence, their strength, and their unwavering belief in justice. They had shown Luke what true strength was, not just in battle, but in character. As the warriors rode off into the distance, Luke turned and walked back toward the heart of Harper's Ridge. The town was quiet now, the murmur of the crowd fading as the realization of what had just happened settled in. Luke knew that change wasn't something that happened overnight. It took time, patience, and effort. But today, he had planted a seed. And from that seed, he knew something new would grow. The streets of Harper's Ridge were still dusty and quiet, but there was a palpable shift in the air. People began to step out of their homes. peeking from behind windows and doors, unsure of what to expect, but curious all the same. It was as if they were waiting for permission to move, to speak, to act. And in that moment, Luke realized that this was the change he had hoped for. It wasn't just about defeating Calloway or taking back his honor. It was about giving the people of this town the courage to stand up for themselves. As he walked toward the center of the town, the sheriff, Marshal Rickson, approached him. The lawman's expression was thoughtful, his eyes scanning the now empty street. "You did it, Luke," Rickson said, his voice steady but filled with an unspoken respect. "You changed things here." Luke nodded, his gaze fixed on the town ahead. "It's just the beginning," he said quietly. "The people here have been living in fear for too long. They need to know they don't have to live that way anymore." Rickson was silent for a moment, then nodded in agreement. "I've always known Harper's Ridge wasn't meant to be ruled by fear. But it'll take time to change the way people think." "It will," Luke agreed. "But it's worth the fight." As they stood together in the center of the town, more and more townspeople began to emerge, drawn out by the quiet strength of Luke's words. Some were hesitant, unsure of what to say or do, but others were braver. They approached Luke, offering nods of gratitude, a quiet acknowledgement of the change that had begun. Luke looked around at the people of Harper's Ridge, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. This wasn't the town he had once known, the place of mockery and pain. This was something new, something born from the ashes of the past. "Thank you," one of the townspeople said, an older man with deep lines etched into his face. "You've given us hope, something we haven't had in a long time." Luke smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "Hope is something we all have to fight for," he said, "and it's something we all have to protect." As the sun began to set behind the distant hills, the people of Harper's Ridge began to speak among themselves, forming small groups, sharing ideas, plans, and dreams for the future. They knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be resistance, but they also knew they had Luke Weston to thank for showing them that change was possible. Luke stood back for a moment, watching the quiet revolution unfold around him. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And as he looked to the horizon, the future of Harper's Ridge felt brighter than it had in years. The days following the confrontation in Harper's Ridge were filled with quiet determination. Luke Weston had proven that change was possible, but the real challenge was just beginning. The people of the town, once cowering in fear, were now finding their voices. They began to rebuild, not just the broken buildings, but the broken spirits that had long held them down. As the town slowly regained its footing, Luke found himself at the center of it all, a reluctant leader in a place that had once rejected him. He had always thought of himself as just another rancher, a man trying to make his way in a harsh world. But now he was something more. It was early morning when Luke rode out to the western edge of the town, a small but determined group of men and women following behind him. The Apache warriors had long since left, returning to their own land, but their influence lingered. Luke had learned much from them, and now it was his turn to lead the way. The town had been fractured, divided between those who had supported Calloway and those who had been silently oppressed by him. There was still tension in the air, old wounds that hadn't yet healed. Luke knew that the next step was crucial. They had to come together. The group rode in silence, the steady beat of the horses' hooves the only sound breaking the quiet. The wind carried with it the scent of the distant mountains, and Luke took a deep breath. This wasn't just about taking back control. It was about creating something new. They were heading to the old Calloway Ranch, a place that had once been the symbol of the town's power and corruption. The ranch stood like a ghost, its barn and fields now overgrown with weeds and dust. It was a reminder of everything the people of Harper's Ridge had endured. Luke knew that if they were going to start fresh, they had to take back what was rightfully theirs. As they approached the ranch, Luke signaled for the group to stop. He dismounted and stood silently for a moment, looking over the land. The house, once grand and imposing, now seemed small and insignificant. Its windows were broken, and the roof sagged, a shadow of the power it once held. "This is where it all began," Luke said, his voice quiet but steady. "It's time we make it something better." The group followed him inside, and together, they began to clear the land, working side by side. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of what they were trying to accomplish felt too heavy. But Luke pushed forward. He had no choice. This was more than just a piece of land. It was a symbol of their future, a future where they were no longer bound by the chains of fear and oppression. Days turned into weeks as they worked tirelessly to transform the ranch into something new, something that belonged to everyone in Harper's Ridge. The people who had once been silent now found their voices, speaking up, working together, and rebuilding what had been lost. Slowly, the town began to heal. The change wasn't immediate, but it was real. Luke's role in the town became clearer with each passing day. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was a leader, a symbol of what could happen when a community came together. But Luke knew that it wasn't just about him. It was about the people who had stood with him, the people who had chosen to believe in something greater than themselves. It was about the Apache warriors, who had shown him that true strength wasn't about power or violence. It was about respect, honor, and the willingness to fight for what was right. One afternoon, as Luke stood at the edge of the ranch, looking over the land they had transformed, Marshal Rickson rode up to him. "You've done it, Weston," the marshal said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "You've changed this town." Luke looked at him, his gaze steady. "It wasn't just me," Luke said. "It was all of us. Everyone here. We've all got something to fight for now." Rickson nodded, a thoughtful look crossing his face. "I never thought I'd see the day when Harper's Ridge would change," he said. "But I was wrong. You've proven that even the smallest of us can make a difference." Luke smiled, though there was a weight in his heart. "It's just the beginning," he said, looking back at the town. "There's still a lot of work to be done, but together, we'll make it right." The town of Harper's Ridge was no longer just a place on the map. It was a symbol of resilience, of strength, and of the power that came from standing together. Luke had given them that power, and in return, they had given him a new purpose. As the sun set over the horizon, Luke stood tall, knowing that the future of Harper's Ridge was in good hands. And in that moment, he realized that the town wasn't just his home. It was a place where hope had been reborn. As the months passed, Harper's Ridge began to take on a new life. The town was no longer just a place on the map. It had become a community, bound together by a shared sense of purpose and the lessons learned from their past. Luke Weston had given them the courage to fight for what was right, and in turn, they had given him something more valuable than he had ever expected: hope. The changes weren't easy, and there were still those who resisted, clinging to the old ways. But the majority of the people in Harper's Ridge now understood that they had a choice. They didn't have to live in fear, they didn't have to bow to anyone, and they certainly didn't have to let their town be ruled by greed and cruelty. One afternoon, Luke stood in the center of the town square, watching as people went about their business. The air was warm, the sun shining down on the town, casting long shadows across the buildings. It was a peaceful scene, but Luke knew it hadn't come easily. He had worked hard to earn the trust of the people, and though the town had made great strides, there was still much to be done. As Luke stood there, Marshal Rickson approached him, a serious expression on his face. "Luke," Rickson said, his voice low, "we've got a problem." Luke turned to him, concern rising in his chest. "What's going on?" "It's Calloway's men," Rickson replied. "Some of them are starting to make noise again. They don't like the way things are going in this town. They want things back the way they were." Luke felt a flash of anger stir within him, but he quickly pushed it down. He knew that Calloway's influence didn't just disappear overnight. "How many are we talking about?" he asked, his tone steady. "A handful," Rickson said. "But they're causing trouble. They're spreading rumors, trying to turn people against each other. If we don't do something, it could start another fight." Luke nodded, his mind already racing. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice firm. "Get the people ready. We won't let them divide us again." As Rickson left to gather the townspeople, Luke stood alone for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He knew this was a crucial moment. The peace they had worked so hard to build could easily be shattered if they allowed fear and division to take hold once more. But Luke wasn't afraid. He had faced worse than Calloway and his men, and he wasn't about to back down now. That night, under the cover of darkness, Luke and a small group of loyal townspeople gathered in the square. They didn't need to speak much. They all knew why they were there. Luke had earned their respect, and now, it was time to stand together once more. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Luke and his group made their way toward the outskirts of town, where Calloway's men were holed up. The morning air was cool, the promise of a new day hanging in the sky. Luke felt the weight of the situation, but he also felt something else, determination. This wasn't just about protecting the town from Calloway's men. It was about proving to everyone, including himself, that the changes they had made in Harper's Ridge were real. As they approached the makeshift camp, Luke signaled for the group to spread out. They moved quietly, staying in the shadows, their eyes sharp. The sound of voices carried in the wind, but there was no sign of the troublemakers just yet. Luke and his group approached cautiously, ready to act at a moment's notice. As they neared the camp, they saw a small group of men gathered around a fire, talking in low voices. Luke recognized one of them immediately. Tom Harris, a former ally of Calloway's who had been part of the group that had tormented him just months before. Tom looked up as Luke and his group emerged from the shadows. His face tightened, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might try to make a run for it. But then, he stood his ground. "What do you want, Weston?" Tom sneered, his hand hovering near the revolver at his side. "We're not going anywhere. You've already won your little fight, but we're not going to let you have the town." Luke stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "I didn't win any fight, Tom," he said. "This town doesn't belong to me, and it doesn't belong to Calloway's men. It belongs to the people, and they've chosen to stand together." Tom scoffed, but there was a hint of doubt in his eyes. He had once been one of the strongest voices in Calloway's camp, but now he wasn't so sure. "You think you can just erase everything?" Tom asked. "You think you can change this town overnight?" Luke shook his head. "No," he said, "but we can start by standing together. We've built something here, and I won't let you tear it down." Tom hesitated, his eyes flickering between Luke and the men gathered behind him. He was a man caught between loyalty to the past and the realization that the future was slipping through his fingers. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he lowered his hand from his revolver. "We'll see about that," Tom muttered, before turning and walking back into the camp. Luke watched him go, his heart still heavy with the knowledge that not everyone in Harper's Ridge was on board with the change. But he knew that the fight wasn't over yet. This was just another battle in a much bigger war, one that would be fought not with guns, but with the strength of the community, with the resolve to stand up for what was right. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Luke turned back toward the town, ready for whatever came next. This was his home now, and he would fight for it until the very end. In the weeks that followed, the town of Harper's Ridge began to settle into a new rhythm. The tension that had once clouded the streets had faded, replaced by a quiet, hard-earned peace. Luke Weston had come to the town as a young, humiliated rancher, but he was leaving it as something more, something the people of Harper's Ridge had never expected: a leader, a symbol of resilience, and a man who had fought for justice. The change wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't easy. There were still whispers in the corners of the town, those who clung to the old ways, unwilling to let go of the power they once held. But they were few now, their voices drowned out by the overwhelming will of the people who had chosen a different path. Luke stood outside his modest ranch one evening, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the land. The smell of fresh earth and grass filled the air, and the soft rustling of the wind through the trees reminded him of how far they had come. The ground he had fought for was fertile with promise, not just for crops, but for the future. A future that belonged to everyone in Harper's Ridge, not just the powerful few. The door to the ranch creaked open behind him, and he turned to see Marshal Rickson walking toward him. Rickson had been a steady presence throughout it all, someone who had always tried to keep the peace, even when it felt impossible. "You did it, Luke," Rickson said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. Luke nodded but said nothing. He knew the marshal wasn't just talking about the victory over Calloway's men. He was talking about everything: the transformation of the town, the quiet unity that had formed among the people. It had been a long road, and they had fought for every inch of it. "It's not over," Luke said, his voice steady. "But we've made a start. The people here have learned that they don't have to live in fear. They've learned to stand together, and that's the real victory." Rickson smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. "I never thought I'd see this town change, but you've done it. You've shown them that it's possible." Luke's gaze drifted back to the horizon, where the sun was now fully set, leaving behind a sky painted with hues of pink and purple. The darkness of the night was creeping in, but it didn't feel threatening. Instead, it felt like a promise of new beginnings. "It's not just about me," Luke said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's about all of us. About every single person who's willing to fight for what's right. They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of the years pressing on them both. Then Rickson spoke again, his voice soft but filled with finality. You've changed everything, Luke. This town, these people, they won't forget what you've done. Luke nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle in his chest. It wasn't the kind of victory that came with trophies or grand gestures. It was the kind of victory that came with a deep, unspoken bond between people, a bond that had been forged through struggle and hardship. I didn't do it alone, Luke said. We did it together. Rickson smiled again, then turned to leave, his boots crunching softly on the dirt path. Luke watched him go, then turned back to his ranch. As he walked toward the small house he had made a home, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't a peace that came from winning battles, but from knowing that the fight for what was right had been worth it. The people of Harper's Ridge had been given a new chance. They had been given the strength to stand up for themselves, to stand up for each other. And Luke had given them that. As the night fell fully over the land, Luke stood on the porch of his ranch, the quiet of the evening settling around him. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the faint rustling of the trees. It was a calm, peaceful night, one that seemed to reflect everything that had changed in Harper's Ridge. Luke Weston had come to this town seeking something: justice, respect, a place to belong. And in the end, he had found it all. But more than that, he had given it to the people of Harper's Ridge. Together, they had built something new, something stronger than any one man, something that would last long after the dust had settled. And as Luke stood there, looking out over the land, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. If you enjoy thrilling and heartwarming Western stories, then this tale of resilience and justice in Harper's Ridge is one you won't want to miss. Set against the rugged backdrop of the American frontier, this story follows Luke Weston, a young rancher who fights to reclaim his honor and stand up for what's right in a town ruled by fear and corruption. With the help of Apache warriors, Luke faces powerful enemies and works to unite the people of Harper's Ridge. As the community begins to heal, Luke becomes a symbol of strength and courage, showing that even the smallest person can make a lasting impact. This Western story is not just about the battles fought with weapons, but about the power of unity and justice. Through determination, Luke changes the course of the town's future, inspiring others to stand up for what they believe in. In this Western story, the fight for what is right takes center stage, as Luke and the people of Harper's Ridge confront their past and build a better future. Western stories like this remind us of the enduring power of community and the courage it takes to fight for justice, even when it feels impossible. If you love Western stories filled with courage, redemption, and the spirit of the frontier, this tale of Harper's Ridge will stay with you long after you've heard it.